Welcome. This is a reading of the article titled Genesis 50, an exegetical and biblical theological commentary. Section 1, Introduction to the Narrative Context. Genesis chapter 50 serves as the capstone and literary climax of both the Joseph narrative, Genesis chapters 37 through 50, and the entire primeval patriarchal epic of Genesis. The narrative brings the arc of the Abrahamic covenant full circle. God had pledged to Abraham that his offspring would sojourn as foreigners in an alien land, face hardship, and ultimately depart with great substance to possess the promised land, as recorded in Genesis chapter 15, verses 13 through 16. Within the organic structure of the promise plan, Genesis 50 provides the essential hinge linking the patriarchal promises to the coming redemptive Exodus, demonstrating how divine providential care preserves the holy seed through famine and exile. Visually and canonically, Genesis presents a striking structural bracket. The book begins with the Spirit of God hovering over the unformed creation to bring forth life, Genesis chapter 1 verse 2, and concludes in Egypt with a corpse embalmed and placed in a coffin, Genesis chapter 50 verse 26. Yet this coffin is far from a testament to defeat. Set against the broader Hebraic cognitive environment and the divine council worldview, wherein God sovereignly directs earthly and spiritual realities to establish his cosmic temple, Genesis 50 demonstrates that human rebellion and death itself cannot derail Yahweh's covenantal agenda. Section 2, Exegesis of Genesis 50. Subsection A, Patriarchal Grief, Egyptian Burial and Covenantal Inheritance, verses 1 through 14. The chapter opens with Joseph's profound emotional grief over his father Jacob's death, transitioning into elaborate Egyptian funerary rites that highlight Joseph's high status while underscoring patriarchal covenant identity. Egyptian embalming and royal mourning, verses 1 through 3. Joseph commands his personal physicians, rather than Egyptian cultic priests, to embalm Jacob, a process requiring 40 days. This is followed by a 70-day public mourning period in Egypt. The 70 days reflect royal honors accorded only to pharaohs or highest-ranking dignitaries, demonstrating the immense respect the patriarchal line commanded within Egypt through Joseph's elevation. Intercession with Pharaoh, verses 4 through 6. Because a mourner in sackcloth could not enter Pharaoh's direct presence, Joseph speaks through Pharaoh's household. He cites the solemn oath Jacob swore to him, Genesis chapter 49, verses 29 through 32, to bury him in the land of Canaan, framing the request in terms of filial duty and sworn obligation. The funeral procession and burial at Machpelah, verses 7 through 14. A massive cortege consisting of Pharaoh's officials, elders of Egypt, and the entire house of Jacob travels to Canaan, accompanied by chariots and horsemen. The local Canaanites witness the intense mourning at Atad and rename it Abel Mizraim, meaning mourning of the Egyptians. Covenantal affirmation. Crucially, Jacob is buried in the cave of Machpelah near Mamre, the field Abraham purchased from Ephron the Hittite as a permanent family burial site, Genesis chapter 23. By insisting on burial in Machpelah rather than an Egyptian mausoleum, Jacob and Joseph affirm that their true identity and inheritance remain anchored in the land of promise, transcending Egyptian status and honors. Subsection B, Human intent, divine sovereignty, and total reconciliation, verses 15 through 21. Following Jacob's death, the narrative shifts to the lingering relational fracture between Joseph and his brothers, leading to the definitive theological statement of the entire Genesis narrative. The brothers' anxiety and fabrication, verses 15 through 17. Deprived of their father's protective presence, the brothers fear Joseph will finally exact revenge for their ancient betrayal in Genesis chapter 37. They send a message claiming Jacob commanded Joseph to forgive them before he died. This psychological realism reveals that despite Joseph's earlier forgiveness in Genesis chapter 45, guilt and fear still plagued their conscience, causing them to manipulate Jacob's memory to protect themselves. Joseph's grief and theological question, verses 18 through 19. Upon hearing their plea and seeing them fall before him, offering to be his servants, Joseph weeps. He responds with the foundational question, "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God?" Verse 19. Joseph refuses to usurp divine prerogative or execute vengeance, recognizing that judgment belongs to Yahweh alone. The paradigm of divine sovereignty, verse 20. Joseph encapsulates the overarching theme of promise plan theology. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive, as they are today. Compatibilist providence. The text maintains full human moral responsibility. You meant evil, alongside absolute divine sovereignty. God meant it for good, without making God the author of sin. Redemptive purpose. The divine intent was not merely Joseph's personal vindication, but the physical preservation of the covenant family, the seed through whom salvation would come to all nations. Comfort and provision, verse 21. Joseph reassures his brothers, promising to provide for them and their little ones. Reconciliation is demonstrated not as a passive sentiment, but as an active, ongoing posture of grace. Subsection C, the faith of Joseph and the oath of the bones, verses 22 through 26. The final pericope details Joseph's remaining days, his prophetic deathbed testimony, and his eventual death in Egypt. Generational blessing, verses 22 through 23. Joseph lives 110 years, an ideal lifespan in Egyptian literature, and sees the third generation of Ephraim's children, as well as Machir's children, son of Manasseh, placed on his knees, signifying their adoption and blessing within the covenant family. The prophetic oath of restoration, verses 24 through 25. As Joseph faces death, he declares to his brothers, "I am about to die, but God will surely visit you," using the double verb construction pekad yipkad, visiting he will visit, and bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. The double verb underlines the absolute certainty of divine intervention. Joseph makes the sons of Israel swear an oath, "You shall carry up my bones from here." The coffin in Egypt, verse 26. Joseph dies at 110, is embalmed, and is placed in a coffin in Egypt. This coffin remains an unburied visible witness throughout the centuries of Egyptian bondage, pointing the Israelites continually forward to their future exodus. Section 3. New Testament appropriations of Genesis 50. Later, biblical authors organically connect the historical events and theological declarations of Genesis 50 to their ultimate Christological and eschatological fulfillments, demonstrating the progressive unity of the canonical promise plan. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 22. The author of Hebrews singles out Joseph's deathbed command regarding his bones as his supreme act of faith, emphasizing that Joseph looked beyond present Egyptian prosperity to trust in God's future covenantal redemption and the promised inheritance. Acts chapter 7, verses 15 through 16. In his defense before the Sanhedrin, Stephen explicitly highlights Jacob and the patriarchs dying in Egypt and their eventual burial in Canaan, tracing the historical sojourn as part of Yahweh's progressive preparation for the true Messiah. Romans chapter 8, verse 28. Paul's canonical principle that God works all things together for the good of those who love him draws directly on the theological logic of Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, in which human malfeasance is subverted by divine providential oversight to secure salvation. Acts chapter 2, verse 23, and Acts chapter 4, verses 27 through 28. The early apostolic kerygma applies the dual agency of Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, directly to the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Wicked men acted according to their sinful intent, yet they accomplished what God's hand and definite plan had preordained for the salvation of the world. Section 4. Theological synthesis. Genesis 50 brings the Genesis narrative to a profound theological conclusion by demonstrating that human sin, death, and exile cannot void God's unshakable promise plan. Through the lens of promise plan theology, the passage highlights the organic continuity of redemptive history. The physical promises made to Abraham regarding a seed, a land, and universal blessing are preserved intact through the providential preservation of the patriarchs in Egypt. The locus classicus of Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, establishes that Yahweh's supreme sovereignty seamlessly integrates human agency and moral responsibility to achieve his redemptive ends. Just as Joseph's suffering, betrayal, and exaltation resulted in the salvation of many lives, this historical reality points forward typologically to the ultimate suffering, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, the true seed who saves the nations. Crucially, Joseph's unburied coffin in Egypt preserves the non-supersessionist reality of the covenant. The concrete, future-oriented promises to ethnic Israel regarding their inheritance remain fully valid within the overarching unity of the one people of God, pointing to the ultimate cosmic renewal where heaven and earth are reunited under the reign of the exalted Messiah.